So I think it's time to give the stage to our special guest of tonight, which is Jeremy Lent. And I would also like to ask everybody to unmute yourself for just 20 seconds to give him a warm applause, because I think that's always a positive way to start your talk. So please unmute yourselves, everybody, for 10 seconds. Yeah, welcome, Jeremy. I will.
All right.
Hey, Jeremy, here's.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Irene. And I love the way in which everyone was sharing on the chat, and just makes me feel, wow, what a wonderful group of people for me to share these ideas with. So thank you to all of you for being here today. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation later on. So I'm going to, as Irene said, start off with like a presentation that we can then use as raw material for discussion later. And I'll share the screen right now to get started here. And well, as you can see from the title, it's sort of very much along the lines of the themes that Irene has been expressing. How can we reimagine our worldview? And so as we kind of ponder this question, really, maybe a first place to begin is with a particular kind of worldview that has only been available to humanity for the last few decades or so, which is quite literally the view of our world. There it is in space, you know, this beautiful shining marble, just in this infinitude of existence. And still, as far as we know so far, the only place that we know of where life exists. And here it's been on this beautiful planet for billions of years. And it's only been the last 100, 200,000 years or so that a species emerged on this planet that had this kind of particular power to actually impose a lot of its own sort of will on the whole, on the planet as a whole. And that, of course, is only something that we've really seen take off in the last century or even the last few decades. So a reasonable question to ask is, well, why do we need to reimagine our worldview? And of course, everyone who's signed up today knows the answer to that. Well, for starters, we're facing this climate emergency that our activities have brought on. All around the world, there are times when I would show this as particular places, but now no matter which continent you're looking at, we know there's wildfires, like just out of control floods, terrible droughts. So we know this is going on right now. But here's the thing, even if we were somehow able to find some sort of magic bullet, some kind of solution to the climate emergency, even that would only affect one small part of the greater impact we're having, because we really need to recognize that the climate breakdown itself is just a symptom of a much larger pathology that we have sort of brought into the world right now. And that's really this vast ecological destruction across the board that our human civilization has been wreaking. In the last 50 years, there has been a 68% decline in animal populations across the entire world. We're facing the sixth great extinction of species since life began on this earth. Only this is the first extinction that's actually caused by the activities of one particular species, ourselves. And even if we were to solve the climate disaster right now, we're almost certainly looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN reports that by their forecast, 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. So anybody looking at this perspective on the world, obviously the first question to ask is, how did we get to this place? And I really looked at this in some depth in my earlier book that came out a few years ago called The Patterning Instinct, subtitled A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And I looked at the ways in which different cultures, all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present day, made sense of the universe. And as I looked at this whole sort of sweep of history, one thing arose from that understanding that is crucial, I think, which is that culture shapes values we see throughout history, and those values themselves shape history. And by the same token, our values now will shape the future. So we need to take a good look at what our values are. And when we do look at that, at our mainstream dominant values, well, one thing becomes really clear. Those values are based on separation. I kind of view this picture as iconic of that in a way. All these people separate from each other, standing there, more connected with their technology, and even separate from the source of the food they're about to eat, not even thinking about where that might have come from. And these values have like a story or a set of stories attached to them, which are implicit in most of the conversations that take place, even though they're not always explicit. And the modern story of separation goes something like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, and that human progress itself has arisen from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as a result of this way of looking at things, ultimately the purpose of life is simply to get wealthy and powerful. So these are the stories that are embedded in our modern media, everything we read, etc. And something that I explore in this new book that just came out recently, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, is that every one of those stories we're told in our modern worldview are not just dangerous, but they're plain wrong. They're false. And in this book and in this presentation today, we're going to be looking at some of the findings of modern sciences, like in neuroscience and complexity science, evolutionary biology and system sciences, that invalidate this mainstream dominant story. And so crucially, we're going to find that they point to the same kind of wisdom that we see from traditional wisdom over the millennia all around the world, from indigenous knowledge, from Taoism, and from Buddhism. And that all points to this notion of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And that recognition of our intrinsic interconnectedness leads to a new story of connectedness, that we are all interconnected in a web of meaning. And the way we're going to look at what that implies in the way we can think about a new worldview is by looking at some of the deeper existential questions that pretty much every human being asks at some point in their lives. It's questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? And we're going to look at each of these questions and look at how our modern worldview gives us an answer that is actually misleading or wrong, and look at the possibilities arising from a different way of answering some of these profound questions. And the book itself is actually structured according to these questions, by the way. So let's look at this first question then. Who am I? Well, the way in which our dominant culture responds to that question really got set in place by Descartes hundreds of years ago, who's basically had the most famous statement really in modern philosophy that pretty much everybody knows, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And that if we unpack what that statement is really saying, it's that human identity itself exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. And as a result of that, animals and even our bodies that conceptualizing faculty exists in are just kind of mere machines. But what modern biologists and ethologists have now understood really clearly is that animals are most definitely not machines. We know, for example, how elephants can communicate over hundreds of miles with other groups through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. We now know that dolphins and whales talk to each other, actually in local dialects. They're believed to call each other out by name and even gossip about those who are temporarily absent. We now know how wolves show this deep family commitment, and males will help raise the young until they reach maturity. And it's easy enough to see some of this intelligence and emotional wisdom in more high-functioning mammals, but now biologists have begun to understand that plants themselves even have this profound networked intelligence, a distributed intelligence. Plants have up to 20 different senses with which they make sense of the environment. They've been shown to act intentionally and purposefully. They learn and have memories. Plants will communicate with each other. Like the biologist Suzanne Simard has written about how, as she studies forests, they actually connect the mycorrhizal fungal network underground to create what she calls a wood-wide web for communication. And they don't just use that for communication, but actually to allocate resources as a community. And here's what's amazing. Even when you go down to the tiniest microscopic cell, what cellular biologists now recognize is that every single cell displays stunning intelligence, awe-inspiring intelligence. A single cell, of which we have 40 trillion, each of us in our bodies, has thousands of sensors and proteins. It sends and receives hundreds of different signals at a time. It's aware of itself and others. It knows what to do and cooperates in community. And the cells will oftentimes make decisions as a group. Now, this recognition of this amazing intelligence and power in nature is something that modern science is only just beginning to uncover. And it kind of overturns a lot of thinking in our dominant worldview. But if we look at other cultures, we see there's been a much deeper understanding for a much longer time of what this core intelligence in nature. If we look back, for example, at early Taoism, most of you are probably familiar with this the amazing book, the Tao Te Ching, which comes from early Taoist thinking over 2,500 years ago. And that's translated as the classic of Tao and De. And now many of you will know what Tao means. And basically it refers to the way or path of how the forces of nature manifest in the world. But a word that's less familiar is this next word, De. And that refers to the spontaneity of the intrinsic nature of natural beings that is inherent in all living things. And when the Taoists saw how non-human beings acted in the world, they saw them as doing so with what they called effortless action. Or they use the word wu wei, which basically means effortless action. It's the state in their minds of acting with De, with that intrinsic inherent power in nature. So they saw non-human organisms naturally acting in wu wei. And then they looked over at humans and asked this question, well, what happened to us? Because we don't act like that. And they recognized that in addition to wu wei, there was this other form of action they saw in humans they called yu wei, or purposive action. And they describe it as things like how humans use a fire to dry up a well or force water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And, you might look at those kind of activities and say, well, isn't that what civilization is all about? that kind of yu way? And the Taoists said, yes, that's right. And they sort of developed essentially a theory of civilization on that understanding. Zhuangzi, one of their great sages, talked about how in ancient times, people belonged to the whole world, what they called the state of perfect unity, living in common with the birds and bees and beasts, and on terms of equality with all creatures, forming one family. But then in the Taoist notion, civilization arose, and then people began to be suspicious, and men began to be separated from one another. Now, what is so fascinating is that modern neuroscience validates, corroborates exactly that Taoist understanding of human evolution. They've identified the prefrontal cortex as mediating our yu-wei cognition, that purposive cognition, as what mediates our symbolic thought, these unique human activities like conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions. And anthropologists now recognize that the emergence of symbolic thought in humans hundreds of thousands of years ago is what led to things like language, culture, art, and tool making, the sort of foundations of modern civilization. So we now can understand that we actually, we think about who I am, we have a dual human consciousness, a conceptual consciousness. It's analytic, slower, rational, effortful, which essentially corresponds with that yu-wei. And that's what Descartes thought was the only thing that had identity. But in addition to that, we also have what we might consider as animate consciousness, that's intuitive, fast, emotional, effortless, which corresponds with the wu-wei in Taoist thought. So then we can begin to realize that our human challenge is not to just identify with that yu-wei, with that thinking mind, but to integrate both systems in harmony. So in answer to that first question, who am I? We can begin to say, well, I'm a mind-body organism that's capable of that kind of integration. So let's turn to that next question. Where am I? Well, the mainstream view basically gives us this notion that we live in a split universe where there's some sort of transcendent dimension where there's a God or whatever we might call him or it. And then there's the material world below. And there's this kind of essential separation between the two. And that's led in modern thinking to this belief that that religion and science exist and should exist in different domains. They don't really talk to each other. But that's also led to our unsustainable worldview that allows many people to feel that they can be praying to that source of transcendent meaning up above, even while they're ransacking nature below. But that's not the only way to try to make sense of the universe. And if we again go back to traditional China, one thing we discover is fascinating is about 1,000 years ago, during what was known as Song Dynasty China, there was the emergence of a group of thinkers that called themselves the School of the Tao. And what's interesting about them is they synthesized some of these early concepts of Taoism from thousands of years earlier, as well as Confucianism, another great Chinese tradition, as well as Buddhism, which emerged in China from India, but had been there for many, many hundreds of years at that point in time. And they created really a synthetic and comprehensive way of making sense of the universe that incorporated elements from all these three great traditions. And we know that school of thought nowadays by the name Neo-Confucianism. And for these thinkers back then, the Neo-Confucians, they saw the entire universe as consisting of qi, which we can translate today in modern terms as sort of matter and or energy. But crucially, they saw the qi only existing with li, the principles by which the qi is connected, that no qi could really exist without being organized under certain principles that were the li. And then when they looked at those principles of the universe, they saw the totality of all the Li in the universe as the Tao. That's what they understood as the Tao. Now, if we fast forward to modern sciences today, like sciences like systems biology, complexity science, chaos theory, sciences that look at the connectivity between things, or system sciences, they also point to this kind of connected universe, this recognition that everything is connected, and importantly, in non-linear ways. And what these sciences have begun to show us is how the interactions between things, like the Li, tell us more about them often than the things themselves. Whether it's like starlings flocking in the sky, or schools of fish in the sea, or the shape of ripples on sand dunes, or the complete global Earth system, or even looking outside Earth into the organization of galaxies, that it's oftentimes the ways in which these things organize that are actually more important. And when they look at these ways in which things are organized, they see there are certain principles that apply to all different systems. And one of the most important of these, they recognize as being fractals. A fractal is basically a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. And when scientists come across fractals, they know that it indicates self-organized activity. And we see it everywhere in the natural world. We see it in coastlines, in the patterning on leaves, in lightning shapes, and the patterning in our lungs, and even in the patterning of our own neurons. And what earth scientists and biologists have begun to understand is that we can see nature itself as a fractally connected system where every cell is organized according to the same types of principles as the organisms of which they're part, which is fractally connected to the species of which it's part. All the species fractally connected to the ecosystem of which they're part, and all the ecosystems ultimately part of the living earth, of Gaia. So with that perspective, when we start asking ourselves, where am I? We can begin to start exploring this possibility that actually I am part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. So from that basis, let's now turn to this next question. What am I? Well, one of those sages from the Neo-Confucian era 1,000 years ago said something very profound. His name is Chu Shi, and he said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. But if we look at our own nature and ask our modern dominant worldview how to make sense of our own nature, well, there's a pretty powerful response that we get, which was probably popularized best by Richard Dawkins in this book he wrote some decades ago called The Selfish Gene, where his answer to our nature is that we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And as a result, a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. And from that, we think this kind of mainstream interpretation of science, of this kind of old science from decades ago, is that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution, that it dictates everything about the organism, that it's inherently selfish and competitive. But what findings in evolutionary biology and systems biology have now begun to show us in the last few decades is every one of those statements about the gene is actually false. In fact, genes are part of an iterative process with the cell. It's really a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity between the genes and the cell of which they're part that create the organism. And biologists now realize that we should see the genotype more like an artist's palette, like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And one amazing, powerful way to recognize this is to just spend a moment and think about the sweet little grasshopper that all of us know, the gentle, solitary little creature munching away on a leaf. Well, it turns out that grasshopper has the same DNA, exactly the same DNA as locusts, which we know as these aggressive swarms that can like destroy like millions of acres of land in just a short amount of time. The organism itself at certain points in time decides to change the ways in which its DNA is expressing itself and actually turns from being a grasshopper to a locust and then can turn back again to that quiet grasshopper. Same DNA. Well, that's a sense of how genes don't dominate our lives. But what about the selfish concept? Well, when we look now at the evolution of the complexity of life over billions of years since it first began on Earth, going from single cells to complex cells, multicellular life, animals and mammals, what we now understand from evolutionary biology is every one of those great steps in the complexity of life came about not through competition, but increases in cooperation. Life itself evolved its abundance and richness through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And a crucial element in that networking is what we see here, this beautiful image of the bee and the flower, that actually organisms work together through what's known as mutually beneficial symbiosis. And it's that symbiosis that creates this harmonic dance of all life, where plants photosynthesize the sun's energy, provide nourishment, insects pollinate those plants, animals transport their seeds and fertilize the soil. The fungus regenerates all the dead matter and then provides these mycorrhizal networks to transport nutrients and then gives nutrients back to the plants to continue this cycle indefinitely. So we now get to understand organisms themselves, like this is in the words of Cole Wusser, another great systems biologist, as self-organized fractal dynamic patterns. He says they're resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. And it's becoming increasingly clear in his words, to understand living systems in any deep sense, we must see them not as machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. So now when we start to think, what am I? Rather than like some competitive machine, we can realize that actually I am a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation, which kind of leads really to this next key question: how then should I live? And again, if we look to our modern world and our dominant worldview for an answer, it's pretty clear. Well, we're told humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy, and selfish behavior actually is in the best interest of everyone. That's what we're told by neoliberal ideology. In these words of Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street decades ago, greed is good. And even those who don't necessarily buy into neoliberal ideology, and to his credit, Richard Dawkins is one of those, they oftentimes believe that we have to then overcome our selfish genes. In his words, let's try to teach altruism because we're born selfish. We need to understand what our selfish genes are up to so we can at least have the chance to upset their designs. But once more, evolutionary biology and anthropology have shown that to be a false conception of humanity. In fact, humans evolved to be cooperative. Early humans were vulnerable to predators in the savannah, early pre-humans. And those pre-humans that learned to collaborate the most were the most successful. And over the millions of years, as we evolved from hominids to Homo sapiens, our identity itself expanded from self and kin to include the entire group that we were part of. And it's that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, that actually differentiates us from other primates. And in those millions of years, as we evolved to be humans, we developed what are known as moral emotions, things we feel deeply, like compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. All of these are things we feel in our gut. We don't just act morally because in Dawkins' mind, we sort of overcome our selfishness and we think we should. We do so because it actually feels right to us as evolved human beings. And indigenous cultures around the world have known this for many millennia. In Africa, there's this great profound concept called Ubuntu, which basically translates as I am because you are. And that's the foundation for a lot of social and political philosophy in Africa. In North America, where I am, the Lakota tribe have this phrase, Mitakuye Oyasin, which means we are all related. And when they're talking about that, they're not just referring to other kin around them, but all sentient beings that they share the world with. So we can now recognize that our flourishing itself is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves, with those cells within us, with others, with the natural world, and with the entire living earth. And human flourishing itself, just like the rest of natural systems, is fractal. That each human mind-body organism is really one tiny fractal within the community, which itself is one tiny fractal within the living earth. And this understanding was probably, in my view, best expressed by this great humanitarian in the 20th century, Albert Schweitzer, who looked at this way in which we're part of life and said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as he said, as a result of that, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So on that basis, when we think about how should I live, we can start from that ancient and new foundation. I should live in reverence and care for all life. And so let's finally turn to this question. Well, why am I? And if we turn once more to what our modern reductionist mainstream worldview tells us, probably best expressed by this Nobel Prize-winning reductionist physicist, Steven Weinberg, who famously said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if we start to look at this world of connectedness, the way we've been describing that modern science has seen, we can begin to realize that meaning itself is a function of connectedness. That as the number of connections increase in any system, they lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. And we can see that in all the kind of systems around us. We know that when single words connect, language emerges. We know that when organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons in our brain and nervous system connect, consciousness emerges. And many of us have probably had at some point in our lives that kind of peak experience of that deep, amazing connectivity of everything in all life, maybe even everything in the entire universe. And oftentimes we're told in our mainstream worldview, well, that's nice to have, but it's got nothing to do with science. It's sort of not rational. It's whatever feeling you have. But what we can now begin to understand is that actually that kind of experience of oneness is one of the great insights of what science actually shows is the underlying reality of our universe. And that connectedness has profound implications, that basically everything you do in your life creates these Lee ripples, which affect everything else in the universe, leading to this deep principle that Buddhism has been aware of for millennia, the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So we exist in an ocean of Lee, and those Lee ripples exist within each of us and in the choices we make, the personal choices and actions we take, the choices to participate in regenerative community or to engage in the broader political process. All of those choices, those actions, those words that we speak, all those together are what actually weave the web of meaning. So now, as we look at this question, why am I? Looking at this worldview of connectedness, we can begin to explore, what does it mean to think that maybe I am here to weave my part in the web of meaning? And maybe if enough of us can connect up in that way, to do that, using our own way, our own strands of meaning, then maybe we have a chance to regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth. So that concludes this presentation. It kind of gives you a summary of what I go into in depth in this book. And as I just kind of close right now, I'm going to leave you with a question that I think Irene's going to ask you to reflect on and maybe discuss in groups. Right now, as we get back together, where are the opportunities in my own life to weave my part, my strand in the web of meaning?